In episode 17, in the case of Lionel, he is about to be the victim of an age reduction. So the story begins at Casslair, and there's Tigra in a crane, and he's lifting up one of the suspension capsules. Now remember, that's the exact same suspension capsules from the flagship when it crashed. So Lionel, who was also there, just told Tiger to be careful with that suspension capsule because he said it was dangerous. I know that, Tiger said, because he just told Lionel that those suspension gases in that capsule alone is very unstable. The worst of it all, Tiger explains, is that the suspension capsule itself is going to explode at any time. Well, the sooner we'll bury it, Lionel said, the sooner I feel better about it. But then suddenly, when Tiger was told to take the crane to the right, then something happened that caused the crane to move. And that's when Tiger shouted, "Look out! The crane's gonna tip over," he said. As the ground underneath the crane collapsed, that causes the crane to tip over. Well, good news for Tiger, he's fine. But not so for the suspension capsule that was still hooked up, but not for long. Back with Lionel, when he saw what had happened, he tried to run as far away as he could, and luckily he did so. And when the suspension capsule landed on the ground, although Lionel jumped out of the way, and that's when the gas exploded from the outside of the capsule. But unfortunately for Lionel, he didn't move quick enough for the gas. So, although he'll be fine as Tiger runs to see if he was okay, Christ, Lionel just told Tiger he's more than okay. He's doing fine. So you know what this means. That means the effects of the gas from the suspension capsule is going to get him younger by the minute. We'll get to that in a minute. So meanwhile at Cat's Lair, so in the control room we have Chitara and Snarf. And that's when Tiger came back and he's with Panthro, and they were about to tell Chitara the bad news. But before they did that, that's when Snarf says, "Where is Lionel anyway?" And that's when, by surprise, remember the suspended animated gas from the suspension capsule that infected Lionel? Well, guess what? He's almost the exact same age as the kittens was, and he's on a hoverboard. Well, he almost lost his balance after pleading the case to say how great the hoverboards were and etc. Well, at least he still has his sword. Well, the sword just pierced the screen of the control room panel, but other than that, Lionel's okay. Unfortunately for Lionel, he couldn't get the sword out, and that's when, by surprise, Chitara was shocked. She says, "Lionel, you're..." And just before she could finish her sentence, that's when he said, "I'm Lionel, Lord of the Thundercats," and he apologized for what happened to the screen. So, Chitara, who was in shock, just asked Tiger and Panther, "What is going on here?" Then Tiger told Chitara how that whole mess started. He said he was going to bury one of the suspension capsules from the flagship that had crashed since last season. But before you know it, when the suspension capsule cracked, that let out the suspension gas that had just to go Lionel just moments ago. Panthro has his turn to plead his case to Chitara. "You saw what the effects did," he said. So in other words, what Panthro is telling Chitara, that because of the gas effects, Lionel's getting younger and younger by the minute. Well, good news for young Lionel. He manages to get the sword out of the screen. That's good news for him. And then he started carving on the panel on the side. So Petro said to Lionel, "Why don't you go outside and play for a while?" he suggested. So before Snarf can escort him out, that's when Lionel pleaded a case to say, "And I thought things were interesting." "Don't worry," Snarf says, "I'm with you, and we're in this together," he said. "I won't let you down," and so both of them left the control room. Later in the meeting room, we have Chitara, Panthro, and Tigra, and Tigra just told Chitara and Panthro some even worse news. He said that Lionel's in serious trouble, and if the effects of the suspension gas from that capsule that was broken moments ago, then that means Lionel is getting younger and younger and younger by the minute until he no longer exists. But neither of the Thundercats were aware that Lionel and, of course, Snarf were listening in through the ventilation shaft. After hearing the bad news, he just hugs Lionel. But Lionel told Snarf that he didn't like to be hugged, and that's when, before Snarf's eyes, Lionel's getting younger and smaller and everything else. Now, Snarf is getting worried and concerned, and he has every reason to. And then younger Lionel just told Snarf that every hour that passes by, the red light just glows around him, and he just gets younger and smaller by the minute. Now, Snarf wanted to know from Lionel, did he ever tell Tigra about it? And Lionel said no, and he said that the reason why he didn't tell Tigra that is because Tigra would get worried. Well, in younger Lionel's case, he's not wrong. Back in the meeting room, that's when Chitara has her turn to plead her case after hearing this terrible news. She said to Tigra that there's something that must be done about it. As a matter of fact, there is. There just might be a chance, Tigra said. So, aha, Tigra has an idea. So he told Panther and Chitara that the only way to reverse the gas effects on Lionel is if Lionel can be inside the Cave of Time, he suggested. Well, Panthro, after he thought about Tiger's idea, but then he soon dismissed it and then told him it's too dangerous because the reason being is because when Tiger went in there one time, he almost died. Well, according to Tiger, he said it may be true, but if we can just pull Lionel out at the exact right time, they just might pull it off to save Lionel, he said. So Tiger told Panther, well, you're right about one thing. This is dangerous. But nevertheless, this is the only plan we have right now, he said. Meanwhile, at Sky Tomb, in the Sky Tomb's control room, we have Luna the leader and Amok that we're watching on screen. And she can tell right now that both Lionel and Snarf are heading towards the Cave of Time. So you know what this means. She has a plan. Back with Lionel and Snarf, and that's when Snarf started pleading his case with Lionel to say he shouldn't be hiding from his friends and they're trying to help. Well, the Thundercats didn't even realize Lionel and Snarf, is that they were watched by Luna, the leader, and of course Otmok from Sky Tomb's control room. So back with Lionel and Snarf, that's when, aha, Lionel said to Snarf that he has an idea. He told Snarf that they could find a cave of time themselves and then beat some bad guys on the way. Although Snarf agrees, but then pleads his case to Lionel to say he's just a young boy and he hasn't had his breakfast and etc. And that's when Lionel got upset with Snarf and says, oh, you worry too much. So when Lionel told Snort that they should have some fun, so that's exactly what they did. And then back at the Sky Tomb's control room, Luna the leader and along with Amok were watching Lionel and Snarf, which of course they're not aware of. Now back with Luna's plan that I talked about. When she overheard that Lionel was going to go to the Cave of Time and Snarf is going with him, but aha, as any bad girl will do, she wanted to make sure it's never going to happen and that Lionel will never reach the Cave of Time. Back with Lionel and Snarf, and so Lionel was asking Snarf how much further to the Cave of Time. We'll get there soon, Snarf said. And of course, Lionel just couldn't wait to get back to his older self so he could drive the Thunder Tank and so on. And that's when Snarf says, why don't you just focus on what you are right this minute? Because now it's all we got right now, he said. But then, by surprise, Lionel just saw something up ahead. And then he ran off, and then Snarf tried to stop him by saying, wait, it's the River of Despair, he said. But Lionel chose to ignore Snarf. Knowing that there were stones up ahead, so Lionel went on the first stone first, and then Snarf runs to catch up with him. So after Lionel was told that it's the River of Despair, so he says, so what about it? It's just a river, that's all. And then Lionel jumps on another stone and another, and so on and so on. And then Lionel knew that Snarf was going to worry about him. So when Snarf says, come back, he couldn't. And then that's when Lionel jumped on the next rock, or so he thought, but that's when something moved underneath him. And that's when Lionel realizes that it's not a rock, it's a Tongosaurus. Back with Snarf, he just covered his eyes as Lionel was screaming, "Help!" And that's when Snarf climbs up the tree and says, "Don't worry, I'll save you." And he attempts to use the vines to swing over to grab Lionel, but then he misses. Luckily for Snarf, he made it across but landed on the ground. Good news, he's fine. Back with Lionel, he's still on the head of the Tongosaurus, but he won't be for long. But then he gets thrown off the head of the Tongosaurus, though luckily he made it across. But by surprise, the Tongosaurus makes it to shore too and then started to attack Lionel, but luckily Lionel misses that attack from the Tongosaurus and it started to climb up. Let's not forget Snarf, he's still there, and he told Lionel watch out behind him, and as the Tongosaurus continues its pursuit, Lionel continues to climb higher and higher. Back with Lionel, well, luckily he made it to the top, but so was the Tongosaurus, and as Lionel joins up with Snarf, that's when they were running, and that's when the Tongosaurus continues his pursuit. But then, long story short, by surprise, the Tongosaurus gets caught in the net. Snarf and Lionel back with them, they managed to get away, but they were surprised. And that's when Snarf pleaded his case to say whoever set that net trap for us really did us a favor. And that's when the voice comes out of nowhere to say no such luck. And that's when, by surprise, three of the lunatics show up. We have Luna the leader, and we have Amok and Chilla. Then by surprise, Luna the leader just let slip to Lionel and Snarf that that trap was meant for them. Then it's Chilla's turn to plead her case, and to coin a phrase, she says, "Now just relax, everything will be cool." So Chilla does what she knows best. She throws Lionel in ice, well, except for Snarf, of course. And that's when he told Chilla, "Back off, or you'll have me to deal with." "Take a chill pill," Chilla said, to coin a phrase, of course. So she froze Snarf in ice, just like what she did with Lionel. So back with young Lionel, who's frozen in ice, but he tells her to let him out of here this minute, but she, Luna the leader, and Amok soon dismissed him. And that's when, aha, Snarf has a plan. He told Lionel to use the sword right away, and so he did. So he told the Sword of Omens to come to his rescue, and by surprise, thanks to Lionel's sword, it unfroze him in ice. Back with the Lunatics, Sheila, Luna the leader, and Amok, when they saw that Lionel's no longer in ice, they were in shock. So Lionel uses his sword power at the Lunatics, but it then missed and struck a tree instead. Then, long story short, now that Chilla has disarmed Lionel, and then both the sword's power and her powers were in the combat, that's when Luna the leader said that's enough. Well, Snarf is still frozen in ice, and that's when Lionel doesn't even realize that during that combat, that's when Atmok of the Lunatics uses his super strength on him. Now, poor Lionel, ashamed with regret, had apologized to Snarf, and the reason why he did it is because he claims his case is his fault, and that he's letting himself and Snarf down. And so, bad news, they have been captured. So, meanwhile, Sky Tomb, there's Lionel and Snarf in a control room. But they're not the only ones, because also in control room were Luna the leader, Amok, Alluro, and Chilla. So Luna the leader had pleaded her case to say, "Let me get this straight. You are a child, right?" That was the case she's asking Lionel. So guess what she did? She said that before she can literally get rid of him, or she would say eliminate him, she has to find a progress that causes Lionel to be a child to do the exact same way to Luna. So Lionel has his turn to plead his case with the Lunatics to say if Panther found out about it, that they'll be in trouble and etc. So Alluro has his turn to plead a case to insult him, and that made Lionel upset. So what Lionel did is that he kicked Alluro in the leg. So what Lionel did next is that he took a little cyclop, and when Chilla saw what had happened, she was going to go after Lionel, but instead she collided into a Laurel while Lionel jumps out of the way. So back with Lionel, remember the cyclop that he took from Laurel? Well, let's just say Lionel had a better use for that. He broke the glass that has the sword inside. So Luna, who saw what had happened, that's when she and Almach were going to stop him. Well, long story short, now that Snurf's free from the ice thanks to Lionel and the Cyclops ball that he threw that it exploded. And that's when not only did Lionel get his sword back, but just like the old Lionel did, well, now his young self, he did what any good guy would do, project the Thundercat signal from a sword. So he did. So meanwhile in the Thunder Tank, we have Panthro, Tiger, and Chitara, and I guess they found out what had happened. And that's when they rushed to the Sky Tomb to where the signal was coming from. So speaking of Sky Tomb, meanwhile there and in the Sky Tomb's control room, so after a long story short, after that battle with the Lunatics and with a little help from the sword, of course, that's when Lionel says, "Quick, Snarf, this way!" And so they both head off and left the control room. Back with Lionel and Snarf, who just left the control room, but they're not the only ones who left the control room, because the two Lunatics are pursuing them, which are Alluro and Chilla. Long story short, back with Snarf and Lionel, when they're about to lose the Lunatics, which are Chilla and Alluro, what they didn't realize is that they fell through the hole in the floor. So now they're imprisoned, both Lionel and Snarf. So that's bad news. So Lionel told Snarf not to worry that he'll get them out of here, but then the red light started glowing all around him again. And then he said to Snarf, "I'm getting younger and smaller." And that's when Snarf, by surprise, was in shock. He says, "Oh my goodness, the process is getting faster by the minute," he said. So after Lionel, who's now younger, was hugging Snarf, and that's when Snarf said, "Don't worry, I know a way to get us out of here. Climb up on my shoulders," and Lionel did. As Snarf was using his tail, and at the same time he was boosting Lionel, saying if they got in one way, then they can get out the same way, but Lionel said that he's too short. So he was hugging Snarf after saying that he was hungry, he wanted to go home, and etc. Now, don't ask me how Luna and, of course, Amok had left the control room, so she looks at Lionel and Snarf and then gave him the bad news that he's never leaving until he was done away with. And so after that, she left. So back with the Thunder Tank, they had managed to arrive at Sky Tomb. So, according to Panthro, he told Tigra that that's where the signal came from. He must have suspected that the Lunatics must have held Lionel prisoner. And the way he suggested the Tiger was simply this: it'll take fancy footwork to get inside because, as he says, and he's not kidding, the Sky Tomb is a fortress. So Tiger has his turn to not only agree with Panthro, but he said that they have to hurry and get Lionel out because, as he says, if his hunch is correct, Lionel's probably 3 years old already. What's worse of it all, Tiger said to Panthro, that Lionel's getting younger by the minute, and that's when they heard a shot from up above, and it's an ice runner. So, in the ice runner, we have Chilla of the Lunatics, and she's attacking the Thunder Tank. Oh, speaking of which, having the cannon ready was Chitara, and she's ready to shoot back at the ice runner. In the rocket pack, we have Alluro, and there he is. He's helping Chilla. As the attacks continued to go back and forth, and it went on and on and on and on, until something got Chitara thrown off the cannon of the Thunder Tank. Back with the Thunder Tank, when Panthro saw what had happened and said that Chitara's in trouble, "I'm afraid we're all in trouble," Tiger says, because he just saw out of nowhere a Lunatacker, and the attack continues to go on and on. Unfortunately for the Thunder Tank, it had failed miserably in trying to escape, so they were all being captured. So we have Lionel, who is now 3 years old. We have Snarf, Chitara, Panthro, and Tigra. So as Panthro tries to use his super strength to get everyone out, and that's when he realizes this, if it's harder to get in, then it's tougher to get out. And that's when, by surprise, Tiger and Chitara saw Lionel shrink down to from 3 years old to now 2 years old. So after Lionel is now 2 years old, that's when Tiger panicked and said that he's running out of time and they must get out of here. And that's when Tiger has a plan to use 2-year-old Lionel to get them out of there. According to Tiger, since Lionel's now 2 years old, he's now small enough to fit through the bars of the door so he can get everybody out. So that's what Tiger did. So good news, thanks to 2-year-old Lionel, he unlocked the door so that everybody can get out. But then, after Tiger picks him up, he told everybody else that they're not out of there yet. They may have a fight on their hands, and they're not joking. So Panthro pleaded his case to Tiger to say, let the lunatics try to fight their way. So that's what happened. Back in the Sky Tomb's control room, we have Luna the leader along with Amok, Chilla, and Alluro. Chilla, Alluro, and Luna were arguing about who's getting the Sword of Omens and etc. So back with the Thundercats, we have 2-year-old Lionel along with Snarf, Chitara, and Tigra. They were told by Panthro to meet him at the Thunder Tank. In the meantime, he has some unfinished business, and so Panthro heads off. So back with the Thundercats that are in the Thunder Tank waiting for Panthro to come back. So although we didn't see it, I'm guessing Panthro took care of the Lunatics. So when Panthro came back and it was time to get out of here, but Lionel forgot his sword. But not for long, thanks to 2-year-old Lionel in baby talk, it calls the sword to come to him, and so it did. So Lionel did get the sword back, so it's now off to the Cave of Time. So later at the Cave of Time, when Tiger tries to convince 2-year-old Lionel to go inside the cave, that's when Lionel shook his head. When he refused, and that's when he tries to convince him again. But that's when Panthro came up with an idea to carry Lionel himself, but Tiger refused, and that he'll grow just like what Tiger did once as a callback to season 1, episode 7, of course. Also, according to Tiger, since he already been to the Cave of Time once by accident, and it was Taro who saved his life. So, Tiger also says that since Lionel is much younger than he is, he can go inside and as he says, it's the only way that he'll go back to his normal size again. Also, according to Tiger, once Linus got back to his normal size, then they can pull him out. But there's only one problem because according to Panther, although he agrees with Tigra, there just might be a way if he can get Lionel to just stop crying. So what Panther did first is that he made a funny face at him, but that made him cry even more. Lionel, that is. Well, since that didn't work, then Chitara has an idea. So what she did is that she patted Lionel's back, hoping that would work. But it didn't. Then Snorfaha has an idea. How about some emergency rations? So when Snarf had asked Pantherl that, and that's when Pantherl said to Snarf, "Oh, come on. This is no time to be eating." "It's not for me," Snarf said, because he just told Pantherl that Lionel hasn't been eating all day. That's why he's crying. It's because he's hungry. So Pantherl, who agrees with Snarf's suggestion, he says, "Well, since we tried everything else, what we got to lose?" So he went to the back of the Thunder Tank and got some emergency rations. Hopefully, Lionel will calm down if he eats a little. Once Panthro got the emergency rations out of the tank, it's now up to Snarf to come up with another idea. He uses the ration on a stick and then lures Lionel to get himself inside the cave. So that's what 2-year-old Lionel did. And then by surprise, Lionel went back to his normal full size again, now 20 years old. So it worked. So good news for Lionel, he was saved just in time thanks to his friends. So now that Lionel's back to his 20-year-old self again, now fully grown, although he had no idea where he was or where he's been, and his memories have been hazy lately. And of course, he had no idea where that biscuit came from and why all of a sudden it was hard as a rock and he bit into it. That nearly broke his tooth. So the Thundercats cheer so since now they got their leader back. Oh, and what about Luna, the leader of the Lunatics? Well, although the plan wasn't fully explained, but it backfired anyway. So meanwhile, at Cat Slayer in the control room, remember the control room panels that Lionel was carving earlier with a sword when he was a child? And that's when both Chitara and, of course, Tigra realized that when Lionel was just a child, he's more troublesome than the Thunder Kittens. And so the carving with the sword that Lionel did as a child that said Lionel was here. But that's not all. When Lionel was just a kid, according to Panthro, he was biting his nunchucks, and worst of all, Snarf's tail. Oh, don't forget, the Thundercats were also in the control room when the Thundercats and Snarf came back. And let's not forget Lionel. He also came back, now 20 years old again. So when Lionel arrived in the control room, that's when Panthro says he's not only glad to see that he's back to his older self, and that's when Lionel, although he agrees, but he says he never remembers the incident much, except for he agrees on one thing. He was such a wildcat when he became a child. He agrees it was right after both Tiger and Shitara had pleaded their cases to say how mischievous Lionel was. Oh, remember that biscuit that Lionel had? Well, he told Panthro the good news, since Lionel said that he heard about what happened to Panthro's nunchucks earlier, so he made something even better for Panthro, a better weapon, out of the biscuit that Lionel had. So yes, it's true. Lionel did have an adventure that day. So that ends episode 17.